Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But KSJE is now listener supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast.
Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author of more than 30 published novels. And on this week's show, we have Megan Baldrige, and she's going to be talking about her newest poetry books. Megan, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Megan. I'm a retired English teacher turned to poetry and various things. I like to knit a lot, and I realized one day that I was knitting too much, and so I started writing poetry about that. And I also like to try to garden well in my garden, and so I've written some poetry recently about that. And I do some other things like quilting and walking in the bosque. I live in Albuquerque near the river, and I tutor kids and things like that. But writing poetry has connected me with a very active community of poets in New Mexico and beyond, which has been a great thing during the pandemic, this larger community to be a part of. And it's given me a chance to voice my opinion or to figure out how I felt about various things. I've discovered the fun of putting thoughts into words over and over again, because I think a lot of poets spend a lot of time editing, probably more time editing than they do writing poems. Most of us write for ourselves.
Not as many people are able to do poetry as a full-time profession. That's hard for most writers of varying genres as well.
Yes.
It can be a tough area of writing to get your work out there and get that notice, I think, in today's world, because it is very saturated.
Yes. And it sounds like you've written a number of fiction books.
Yeah,
right?
mainly
Novels?
fiction.
And so you've experienced that as well. There's been a great support system in Albuquerque of Jules Nyquist, who's a fellow poet and who has kind of shown the way of how to use Amazon's platform as a way to get a book online and to sell books through Amazon. And she's been very helpful in giving hints about how to whip a manuscript into shape and how to get a book cover designed and things like that. There are, a number of steps. And so I've been very lucky to run into helpful people, and hopefully that also exists in other communities as well. So it's been fun to be able to see. I can send friends or people when I do readings. If I don't have a copy of a particular book, I can send them to Amazon, where it is easy to use. And so the market is saturated, but it's also a great time to be able to just get your words out into the public.
It is. That is something that is a very interesting aspect of publishing today, that it is more accessible to those who want to put their work out there. But then that means, more work is getting put out there. So it's kind of one of those double-edged things where trying to navigate that takes some trial and error at times. But I think that is an amazing thing about the writing community in general, is that with maybe a few rare exceptions, writers tend to be very helpful and very willing to help each other. And at least as I've experienced as well, both in online communities and local communities. And for a pursuit that's so individual and can be kind of lonely at times, that's wonderful to find those groups that you can find that support with. That's great that you found that where you are.
Yeah, and I think some of the poetry readings that I've been to have been attended by people. They've been based in, communities around the country. The poets who have joined in have been poets from India and from both coasts. And so it's interesting to find this commonality and be able to get to know people during this strange period of time and hear poetry that's different than anything that I've heard before, and also hear it performed or recited by the person who wrote it.
It's wonderful. That's a neat thing about poetry, especially I think that spoken performative element to it. There's a local poet in this area, kind of southern Colorado, Art Goodtimes, and he is one of my favorite people to listen to him read his
Yes.
poetry. He just has such a natural ability to bring out more of what he's saying with the way that he says it. And I think that's a really neat aspect of poetry that you don't necessarily get in other forms of writing.
Yeah, he's someone who's come down here too, and he really gives back to the community. He also happens to have a good sense of humor in his writing, and it's always delightful. He doesn't take himself too seriously, and so yeah, he's a wonderful guy.
He is. I've really enjoyed the times I've had the opportunity to interact with him. Now, you did mention earlier that process of hearing other poets, new styles, new ways of reading, and sharing that with other people. What is your process like?
Well, I have some distinct interests in, say, politics, in my dog, in gardening and knitting. And so as I'm kind of going through the day, I'm retired, and so I have more time to think about those things, those kind of retirement things. But in the past, it would have been teaching and students who I taught. But as I'm going through the day, I am just jotting down notes about things that strike me as funny. Usually I think what initiates the process for me is noticing anomalous events or hypocrisy, say in politics, someone who's talking about something but who's acting in a different way, or my dog who is supposed to be trained because he went to obedience school, but in actuality, he's a wild beast when we go out for walks. So I'm struck by the contrasts that dwell within each of us, or that are apparent in life, the way things should be, but the way they are. And so those kind of things jar me, and I start to write down some notes. And then usually at the end of the day, if I have some time, I start to think of, well, that reminds me of something else. People are inspired to write for lots of different reasons. Usually I have a point I want to make. And listening to me, pontificate or lecture someone like my kids, for example, about that point would not be very interesting, but I can talk about that point in a quieter way by noting something in poetry about the political season, or about my dog, or about knitting, the behavior of knitters I know who are kind of obsessed and who knit way too much and don't exercise enough and things like that. And so I can notice those things and try to think of examples. And usually I am driven not by word music, but by a thought that I want everyone to know, to agree with me about. But I try to add alliteration. I try to work with rhymes sometimes, but at least alliteration and words that sound good together. And so those are layers that come later on. So a lot of times I write down the ideas that I want to include in this poem about the garden, or say about how the weeds are taking over my life. And then I just keep going back to it, hopefully within a short period of time, day after day, or night after night, and keep thinking of new ways to say that thing that I really want to get out there in better words, in words that sound better, or that connect with each other in a better way, or words that are shorter, or cutting out words. But it is a long editing process, and I don't have an editor. I really have to depend on myself as an editor because I'm self-publishing. At a certain point, I feel like something is ready to just let it rest. And usually I have another idea that I'm exploring at that point, and then I want to go off on that tangent. And I think I've written maybe 12 or 15 books, and each of them has taken probably been retired, and it's been the pandemic. So I've written 2 or 3 books a year. So I've really spent a lot of time on going over and over the words. But then I have to return and edit the whole manuscript when I feel like there are enough poems and they relate to each other. Usually they're about a topic, a subject like my dog or the garden or knitting or politics. And when I feel like I've got enough, maybe 60 poems or something like that, I look them over again, and then I go through the editing process all over again and really try to get, really focus on word sounds, because usually I'm not very good at finding great word sounds in the beginning. And I really want to make them sound lyrical. But then at a certain point, I say, well, I could keep going and the poems could probably improve, but I really have so many other things that I want to say that I think I'm just going to stop here. And then in the future, if I'm submitting a poem to a contest or for publication somewhere else, I will really work much harder on the word music part of the poem. So that's how it goes for me. And I think, other poets also spend loads and loads of time hacking away at words, trying to make words flow together better. And a lot of times, I guess it's just getting rid of words, getting rid of the adjectives, getting rid of descriptive words that aren't necessary because you're describing what you're saying without using adverbs and adjectives, which are almost a too easy a way to describe something. So I just keep cutting away words, I think, as I go along. That's more or less it.
Well, that's fascinating listening to you talk about that process because it's very different, at least for me in fiction writing, like the focus of what you're doing when you're editing. And something that struck me while I was listening to you describe that was how useful it would be if everyone had to take a class on writing poetry and learn that idea of really weighing your words and considering your thoughts and what you're focusing on. To that level, I think it would create a lot more introspection in people.
Yeah.
We could
Well,
use that.
I do. Yeah. I think yes, I think it's a good practice in making writing more direct and concise. And I think it probably would help any writer. And I wasn't aware, I did a little bit of writing before that, and I wasn't really aware of how much I could pare away words in prose writing as well, and how much that would improve the writing. And I've just written some introductions to some friends' books and things like that. And I feel like the poetry has, since I started writing poetry, and I feel like the exercise in editing my own poetry has really helped me to become a better prose writer. And I don't want to waste anyone's time, because that's part of what poetry is about.
Yeah, that's something I've experienced working in journalism because I started out in fiction, and journalism is just such a different beast. It's so much about being concise and to the point and really measuring your words like, literally in inches when you're, formatting for print. Yeah. And right now I'm working with a lot of newer writers who are freelancing and learning the journalism style. And that's so much of the editing I do is we don't need these 3 words here. Let's pare this down. Let's make this a little bit more understandable. And it teaches me a lot as well. And in my other forms of writing, just really considering the words that you're putting down and what they mean and are they necessary. And that's a fascinating process.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great process for writers and editors to go through. And hopefully your people who are new writers get the picture. Although if you're being paid by the column inch, you're not tempted to excise and cut out as many words as you might maybe could.
True, unless you're going over, which is usually my problem, and then I'm always struggling to stay within the inch and word count limit. But it definitely, puts a different perspective on what you're writing and what you're trying to communicate and how effective you are at that. And I would think writing poetry in that exercise of, like you said, with your process, you have something that you want to get across and really thinking about the best way to do that so the person reading understands your point of view.
Yeah. And I think I hope we're not in a post-literate world, but we are in a slightly less literate in the attention the time that we spend on a single piece of writing that we're reading. We're kind of or we're giving less attention to things and spending less time with things. So writing really has to earn our attention. And I think the quality of getting to the point quickly and being concise and getting the right word, having trying to develop your vocabulary and having a good word for what you're trying to convey and not using overused words or trite words or cliches a lot. That's really helpful in hooking a reader, because I fear that younger readers are less likely to read something like print, like a newspaper or book or a book of poetry, and they're more likely to have a diverse, I mean, they may be reading as much, and they're probably reading more than we were reading in my late 60s. They may be reading more than I'm reading, but they're not reading as many books, or they're not reading as deeply into books, probably, or magazines or newspapers. And so we really have to hook them. We really have to work hard to, capture someone's attention.
Absolutely. Yeah, that attention span for readers has been studied quite a bit in the way that it's shortened, and the first glance, those first couple of sentences on even like, book descriptions are so important, and it has to grab someone and make it something that they feel like is going to be important to them. And that's a really hard challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of competition.
There is, just for our attention in general. There's so much out there that, makes a lot of noise, and it's hard to quiet that noise sometimes and get someone to think and really pay attention to what's being said or presented to them. One of the other things that I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned that the Still Life with Knitting book was one that you worked on largely during the pandemic. And I found it so interesting to compare that to the other one that you sent me, the Cultivating Weeds, which had more of a theme of gardening. And it was interesting to read the poems in each one and see how that focus shifted slightly. In both of your books, I definitely feel your passion for what you're talking about. That really comes across well, and it's apparent that these are both topics that you feel deeply about and that you love. It was interesting, though, to see the internal nature of some of your topics with the Still Life with Knitting and themes in the Cultivating Weeds that were more growth and focused on kind of movement of the insects in your garden, some of the plants, some of the animals in there. I just wanted to ask you about that contrast and just writing through those beginning stages of the pandemic versus some of what you worked on later, and how your day-to-day life kind of influenced those.
Yeah, well, yeah, they're definitely both. I think that all poems were influenced by the changes in day-to-day life from before the pandemic, through the pandemic, and through different stages, like the beginning stages of the pandemic, and then the kind of long long continuity, the long winter of the pandemic, and then after, the feeling of relief when we were moving out of the pandemic. And the garden poems I wrote over a longer period of time. I have been working on my garden for a long time without always feeling like I was never quite conquering the garden. And so I had written some poems about, always struggling with like the hose that burst, like the hose that I gave away because it was kind of old, and then the new hose that burst the first day I used it, and realizing that it seemed to describe like old things that should be cared for versus new things. That was something that had happened before the pandemic, and I had written down some notes and thought, well, someday when I have time, I'll write a poem about this. And when I realized that I had a few garden poems and I was spending time in the garden during the pandemic, I realized, oh, I've got these poems from the past about bugs. I'm always defeated by the bugs that, the squash bugs. I don't know if you have them in the Four Corners area. I'm guessing the squash bugs are just as bad there as they are here.
They're everywhere.
And the squash bugs that just take over and they multiply just in front of one's eyes. So I was interested in a lot of different things, all of which were kind of bigger than me. All the forces of nature that force you to acknowledge that you're a small person in the world, and that having a well-groomed garden may not be possible. And so those poems I was writing over a period of time, and I just noticed a lot of different things that colluded to teach me that lesson over and over again. Everything in the garden seemed to, tell me that I was a person, and that there's a lot of living beings that are not controllable in the greater world. And and then the still life with knitting. I think I just did a lot of knitting at night during the pandemic, and so I just was kind of writing about that, and then writing about the transition to a new president was exciting. I mean, that was the first poem was about watching the inauguration of President Biden and noticing Bernie Sanders sitting on the stairs by himself with these mittens that are pictured on the front cover of the book, with these mittens, and realizing that the blogs, knitters blogs and Instagrams and were exploding with excitement about Bernie Sanders mittens, which is kind of a small view of the world that most people who are not knitters would not know about or care about, really, is Bernie Sanders mittens. But it just was a way to describe the excitement about, having this new president and what the change. And so I don't know. I'm not quite sure what how the books are different. I know that they're both about kind of passions of mine, but yeah, I mean, was there something else that you noticed that was different, or a different rhythm of the books?
I think for me, when I was reading it, I think the contrast that I was seeing was in the still life with knitting. It was, it's hard to put it into words now when I'm thinking about it, but yeah, with the still life of knitting, it felt like you were experiencing kind of this world within a smaller space almost.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
sense of being closed down and a new transition and trying to figure out, how do you exist in this really weird world we're all experiencing? And then, as you mentioned with the gardening one, you said that you kept getting this lesson that you're one person within this wider world and that there's so many other forces that were outside of your
Hmm.
control. And I think it was kind of that contrast that struck me of a world feeling like it was narrowing down on ourselves. We're staying in our houses, we're trying to figure out what to do with ourselves. And then that idea of you're still just a small part of something much, much bigger than you.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there was also a slight seasonal difference, and the knitting one was written in the beginning of the pandemic, in like March and February, March, April, when in the very beginning, the first year of the pandemic, when we were really closed in. I mean, we were taking, most of us were trying not to go out at all, and staying home 24/7. And the garden one was written outside, and having a backyard. I happen to be really lucky and live near near a nature center in Albuquerque, and have like a big area that I can wander around, and a backyard that is kind of uncontrollable. And so I was describing um, spending time outside after the pandemic had started, and we're still trying to be cautious, but also getting out of the house, which was really helpful, because it was claustrophobic. I mean, most people who are retired and who are knitters were initially just kind of gleeful about, being able to knit as much as they wanted, or, crafters, maybe sewing sewists and sewers were just, thrilled, quilters, to have all this free time if they didn't have another job, if they were retired, if they're lucky enough to be retired, which I was. And but then after a little while, it's like, there's you really are we're really lacking stimulation and just the joy of our community, of our real life community. And whereas being outside and being able to walk in the along the river, or along the Rio Grande, which is where I live, or in the backyard, working in the backyard, was just pure delight. And it was an antidote to that feeling of claustrophobia. And so, yeah, so it did, I can see that those worlds were very different. They were kind of part of different stages, I guess, along of the pandemic as I lived it. And, the people who were on the front lines who were having to work or who were needed to work, or the parents who were working with their kids, who were working at home and who were homeschooling their kids. Boy, I just hats off to what they were doing. That was, hopefully it was a positive experience in the grand scheme of life, but it sounded like it was really hard.
Yeah, it's definitely a period of time where I think people experienced the same phenomenon very differently in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And I think that would be fascinating at one point to be able to collect a lot of those stories and see how people got through it. And I think maybe gain a little bit better understanding of the people around us.
Yeah. No, I would agree. In New Mexico, I think we were realizing that there are communities, for example, in the Navajo Nation that were off the grid, that didn't have connection to internet and things like that. That was a surprise to many people outside of that community, and hopefully that, people rallied together, and, the government has rallied to help connect the Navajo Nation to the internet, because that was a shock.
Yeah, it definitely, I think, made a lot of people and organizations a little bit more aware of where some of those gaps are and what needs to be done to fill in those gaps. But we are just about out of time. I feel like that went by really fast, which is great because it was a lot of fun to talk with you. So I just wanted to remind readers that the two of your newest books, the ones I was lucky to read, were Still Life with Knitting and Cultivating Weeds. And people can find those, you mentioned, on Amazon. Any other outlets that they should look if they would like to check it out?
I think probably Amazon is the most reliable. There's Organic Books is a used in new bookstore in Albuquerque that has that's done a wonderful. They've done a wonderful service and provided space for local writers, and amongst whom is me. So Organic Books also in Albuquerque, I would recommend.
Wonderful. And where can people find you to stay up to date on your new projects that you might have?
Let's see. I'm too old to be connected to a lot of things, but I do have an Instagram account that is called Knitfluence, because I write about knitting so much, and I have some knitting poems in there. So it's KNITFLUENCE, Knitfluence. And so probably that's the best way. Otherwise, my email address is Megan Baldrige, BALDRIGE @gmail.com. And it's always wonderful to hear from anyone. And those are the two ways that I reach out to the world.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed having the opportunity to read your poetry as well.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.